It was early autumn when this happened. I lived alone in a small ground-floor apartment on the outskirts of Portland. The place was simple, but comfortable. A bedroom, a small kitchen, and a large window facing the back garden. I remember that week it rained every day, and the noise of water hitting the glass was something constant at night. That morning, I woke up suddenly, not knowing why. The rain was still falling, and the room was almost completely dark, illuminated only by the yellowish light of the pole outside. I looked at the digital clock on the table, 3:12 in the morning. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard the sound. 3 light knocks on the window, followed by absolute silence. They were rhythmic beats, as if someone had used their knuckles. At first I thought it was some branch or the strong wind throwing drops against the glass, but soon the sound was repeated, slower, deliberate. I sat on the bed, trying to hear better. The noise undoubtedly came from the window next to the bed. And that's when I heard a voice, low and masculine, calling my name in an almost polite way. "Claire?" The way he said my name made me cold. It didn't sound threatening nor drunk. It looked like someone trying to be polite at 3 in the morning, which in itself was weird. I stood still, holding my breath, and tried to convince myself that it was a confused neighbor. The water flowed through the glass, making a continuous sound, and between a gust of wind and another, the beats returned, now only 2, well marked. "Clara, can you open a second?" The voice was low, close, as if the person was glued to the window. I reached for the curtain but stopped before playing. My heart was beating hard enough for me to feel it on my neck. I opened only one finger of the curtain, as little as possible, trying to see the garden. The light from the pole covered part of the soaked grass, and the rest was shadow. There was no one there. No silhouette, no movement. Only the rain falling and a big puddle very close to the window. For a few seconds I thought I had freaked out. Then I saw, in the upper corner of the glass on the outside, there was a hand mark. Sharp, 5 fingers spread, water running down the lines. The drawing seemed recent, as if someone had pressed the palm there, just not. I closed the curtain back in an impulse, swallowed dry, and sat down, not knowing what to do. "Do you want me to continue?" I stood still, listening to the sound of the rain trying to cover the silence inside the room. I took the cell phone to call someone, but the screen was black. The battery had run out. I thought about sending a message to the neighbor next door, but I remembered that the Wi-Fi was bad when it rained. The room seemed smaller, as if the air had become heavier. I got up and on the lamp just to convince myself that everything was fine. The yellowish light filled the room, and for a few seconds the fear decreased. I went to the window carefully and moved the curtain away a little. The hand mark was still there, darker now, but the garden was still empty. I decided I would call the police if I heard it again. I tried to convince myself that it could have been some lost delivery man or someone looking for shelter from the rain. But the way the voice said my name didn't leave my head. That wasn't a mistake. It was personal. I sat on the bed again, trying to calm down, and that's when the sound came back. Not the knocks this time, but the noise of wet steps outside, slow, going from the window to the back door. The sound of footsteps on the grass was muffled by the rain, but you could hear the rhythm. One step, then another one, then nothing. The kind of silence that makes the whole body freeze. I got up slowly without making noise and went to the kitchen, which faced the same direction as the garden. The curtains there were thinner, and the light from the pole illuminated the floor outside a little. I stood still, trying to see something, and suddenly a dry sound made my heart stop. A unique beat, now at the back door. It wasn't strong, it was almost polite, like a touch of someone who doesn't want to scare. "Claire?" The same voice. Same calm intonation. I felt a chill go up my back. I almost answered instinctively, but I stopped before any sound came out. I walked on my back until I got the cell phone and realized that I was still out of battery. I looked at the wall clock. 3:28. I took the kitchen knife that was in the sink and stood there standing, breathing slowly. The sound of footsteps came back, now going again towards the bedroom window. I could hear the light creak of the wet grass moving away, as if the person walked in circles around the house. When I tried to look again, something made me stop. A weak noise inside. It was the sound of the bedroom window, the snap of the wood moving. Someone was trying to open it very slowly. I ran to the room and locked the window before even looking out. My hands were shaking so much that I almost let the latch escape. I leaned my ear against the glass and heard the rain beating hard, but under it I could still distinguish that rhythmic sound. Fingers beating, not hard but insistently, as if the person was trying to show patience. "Claire." The voice was lower now, dragged. I stepped back and stood in the middle of the room staring at the closed curtain. The light of the lamp oscillated, creating shadows that seemed to move on the walls. Everything inside me screamed for me to get out of there, but my legs did not obey. I walked to the door to leave the room, and at the exact moment I turned the handle, the sound from outside stopped. No steps, no beats. Only the rain. The silence was so sudden that it seemed wrong. I waited a few seconds, and when I was about to open the door, a loud snat echoed outside as if something had fallen. I went back to the window slowly, held the curtain and pulled just enough to look. The light from the pole still illuminated the garden, and the first thing I saw was the handmark. Now there were two. One side by side, a little further down in the glass. The two perfectly outlined, as if someone had leaned to look inside. My first instinct was to scream, but the sound just didn't come out. The two handmarks were there, perfectly visible, and the rain only made them flow even more, as if they had just been left. I took a step back, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass. Suddenly a third beat, dry, short, echoed in the center of the window, so strong that the lamp shook. This time, it didn't come accompanied by any voice. I ran to the landline which was in the room and dialed the police number with trembling hands. While I was waiting, I looked into the hallway and saw a flash coming from the room. The lamplight had gone out by itself. The attendant answered, and I could barely explain what was happening. He asked me to lock everything and stay away from the windows until the car arrived. I did exactly that. I closed all the doors, turned off the lights, and sat on the kitchen floor trying to hear anything. The sound of the rain hitting the roof seemed too loud, covering everything. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps again, this time on the front of the house, slowly moving away until it disappears completely. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they searched the entire backyard. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone, only the marks of the two hands on the glass, one of them smaller, almost childish, just below the other. Story 2. I've been living alone for a few years in a small apartment on the 4th floor of an old building in downtown Seattle. It's a quiet place during the day, but at night there is always some noise coming from the street. Cars passing by, people talking loudly, the distant sound of the subway. I got used to it over time. That morning, however, I woke up with a sound that made me sit on the bed right away. The intercom. A short, insistent touch at 2:47 in the morning. At first I thought I had dreamed, but the sound rang again, longer this time. I was silent for a few seconds, trying to process. None of my friends visited me without warning, and I hadn't ordered any delivery. I took the cell phone to see if there were messages, but the screen was clean. The rain was falling outside, and the sound of wet tires on the street made everything stranger, more isolated. I went to the intercom and pressed the button to listen. A male voice answered almost immediately. "Good night, miss. I'm from the delivery service. Can you open it, please?" The voice was calm, polite, but there was something about it that made me restless. I asked what he was delivering, and the man paused before answering. "A request for Hannah. It's in the system." At the time, I felt a chill. No one but me knew that I lived there for a short time, and the building was small, with only 6 apartments. I stood still, without saying anything for a few seconds, waiting for him to continue. The voice repeated, this time lower. "Can you come down to get it? It's raining a lot out here." The tone seemed calm, but not natural. It had a rehearsed cadence, almost as if he was reading. I asked which company it was from, and he replied night deliveries, which didn't make any sense. He said that I hadn't made any order, and that he must have had the wrong address. Total silence. The intercom was silent for a few seconds, and then came a weak sound, breathing. A slow, long breath, as if he was still holding the button and listening to me. "Sir, are you still there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I hung up and the apartment was completely silent, with the sound of the rain outside filling the space again. For a moment I thought about just going back to bed, but something bothered me. I went to the living room window, which faced the front of the building, and looked at the street. There was no delivery car, no box, only the wet sidewalk and the lit pole. I stayed a while longer looking out the window, trying to see better through the blurred glass. The rain reflected the light of the pole and created that yellowish glow on the wet asphalt. The clock marked 2:55 a.m. I was about to close the curtain when the intercom rang again, a short, insistent ring that made me jump. I waited a few seconds, my heart racing, before answering again. As soon as I pressed the button, the voice came back. "Hannah, can you open it now, please?" This time he said my name with an uncomfortable familiarity, dragging the words. It seemed less professional, more personal, as if he was watching me. "Are you sure you're at the right address?" I asked. The voice replied without hesitation. "Yes, 4th floor, middle window." My stomach froze. I looked at the window automatically, and the reflection of the curtain prevented me from seeing outside for a second. I went to the building's camera, a simple system that showed the main entrance. When the image loaded, I almost dropped the cell phone. A black hooded man was standing on the sidewalk, motionless, looking straight at the camera lens, neither to the building nor to the door, to the camera. He didn't say anything, he just stood there, his head slightly tilted, as if he knew I was looking at him at that very moment. I was paralyzed, looking at the screen, unable to look away. The image was grainy because of the rain, but you could clearly see his face illuminated by the light of the pole, dark eyes, neutral expression, completely motionless. He didn't hold anything, no box, no package. I was just there, standing still. The intercom still emitted that light buzz, as if the line was open. Suddenly, the voice came back, now closer to the microphone. "Hannah, can I go up? I just need to leave something for you." The tone was still calm, but there was something wrong. He was too polite, as if he tried to imitate a normal person. I turned off the intercom without answering. My whole body was shaking. I took my cell phone to call the concierge, but I remembered that the building didn't have a doorman during the night, only a janitor who came in the morning. Sweaty hands made it difficult to even type. I tried to call the police, and while I was waiting to call, the intercom sound rang again. 3 touches in a row. Fast, impatient. The sound was too loud for the silence of the apartment. I ran to the device and pulled the plug from the outlet. The noise stopped instantly, and the apartment was in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of the rain outside and the noise of my heart beating hard. I stood in the middle of the room with the intercom plug still in my hand, trying to hear anything but the rain. The feeling was that time had stopped. Then, something made the blood freeze, a sound coming from the door of the building downstairs. It wasn't a knock. It was the metallic noise of the handle being forced. The sound echoed weakly through the corridor, as if someone tried to open the main door, insisting slowly. I took the cell phone and went back to the window. The building's camera was still open on the screen, but the man no longer appeared. The space on the sidewalk was empty, only the rain pounding and the puddle reflecting the light of the pole. I pushed the curtain away and looked straight at the street. That's when I noticed movement in the corner of the screen. He was no longer on the sidewalk. Now I was standing under the entrance awning, out of reach of the rain, standing right in front of the glass door. He didn't move. I was just there, looking up, in the direction of the windows. For a moment, I was sure he was looking straight at me. I closed the curtains tightly, locked the window, and sat on the floor trying to control my breathing. I called the police again, and the attendant asked me to stay on the line. While she was talking, the intercom sound rang again, even with the wire still disconnected. The sound was the same, the short and insistent touch repeating at exact intervals. I looked at the device, still with the cable disconnected, and felt a chill run through my whole body. It was impossible to be playing. The attendant was still on the line, asking if I was safe and if there was someone trying to get in. I told her everything, stuttering, and she said that a vehicle was already on its way. I sat on the floor, holding the phone tightly while the sound of the intercom stopped and went back, stopped and came back, as if someone outside knew exactly what they were doing. After a few minutes, everything was silent. No touch, no sound. The only noise was that of the rain and the light buzzing of the lamppost outside. I got up and went to the window slowly. I moved the curtain away a little, enough to see the street. It was empty. No sign of man, no shadow, no movement. I looked for a while until the red and blue lights began to reflect on the bedroom wall. The police had arrived. 2 officers entered the building and searched the entire ground floor. They didn't find anyone. When they asked to see the camera images, I showed what I had recorded. But in the saved video, the man never appeared, only the wet sidewalk, completely empty, at 2:47 a.m. Story 3. It was a winter dawn, one of those in which the air seems stopped and the silence of the street weighs even inside the house. I had gone to bed late after watching TV, and I remember being in a heavy sleep when the sound of the doorbell made me wake up. Fast, repeated, insistent touches. I looked at the clock. 3:03 a.m. I lay down for a few seconds, trying to understand if it was a dream or reality, until the sound came again. 3 rings, then a pause and 2 more. It wasn't an accidental touch. Someone was pressing the button on purpose. I got up with my heart racing. My house was on a residential street, quiet, with no movement at that time. I went to the living room window and looked at the street. No cars, no lights on in neighboring houses. The nearest pole blinked from time to time, leaving everything a little gray. The sound of the doorbell echoed again, louder now. I took my cell phone to see who it was on the security cameras. The application took a long time to load, and for a few seconds only the dark image of the balcony appeared, illuminated by the dim light of the sensor. When the image finally stabilized, I didn't see anyone. The entrance corridor was empty. I waited a while, still looking at the screen, but the sound of the doorbell rang again. Only now with an exact interval between the ringtones, almost like a pattern. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, pause. That gave me a chill. It seemed that the person knew I was watching and did it on purpose. I walked slowly to the door, trying to hear if there were steps outside. Only the distant noise of the wind and the creaking of the swinging gate structure. I peeped through the peephole, but what I saw was only the emptiness of the balcony. No movement. I stayed there for a few seconds, trying to gather courage to open the door. When I finally turned the doorknob and pulled it slowly, the cold morning air came in at once, and the silence outside was absolute. No car sound, no sign of life. Only the sound of the wind passing through the trees and the weak noise of the pole energy. I stood there with my heart racing, looking at the completely empty street. I was about to close the door when I noticed something in the corner of the entrance carpet. A round wet mark, as if someone had pressed their finger there. That brand made me freeze. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was right in the center of the carpet, wet enough to reflect the light. I bent down to look better and realized that it looked like an impression, not of a shoe or water, but of something smaller, like the tip of a finger. I watched for a few seconds, trying to understand how it could have appeared there, until I heard the sound of the doorbell once again. This time I was facing the door, and the sound came from the button a few centimeters from my face. I stepped back immediately, my heart racing, and closed the door tightly. I went back to my phone and reopened the camera app. I recovered the previous minutes, the period in which the button had been pressed. In the video, the image was dark, distorted by the dim lighting of the balcony, but you could clearly see the doorbell button being pressed by a finger covered by a black glove. The strange thing is that the person who did this was with his back to the door. The camera captured the arm coming from behind, as if someone was turned to the opposite side, pressing the button without looking. The video showed the finger touching the button twice and then nothing. No visible person. I kept looking at the recording several times, trying to find some reflection, any detail that explained. But the framing showed only the lower part of the body, and the rest was shadow. No face, no clear silhouette. The feeling was horrible. The fact that the person was on his back scared me more than if he was staring at the camera. It seemed intentional, as if he knew exactly where the lens range ended. I paused the video and noticed something that made me freeze. The arm moved slightly after the touch but did not move away. The finger rested there for a few seconds, pressing the button, as if he wanted to make sure I would hear. I closed the app and went to the living room window, opening the curtain carefully. The gate was still locked, the balcony empty, but the carpet, which used to have only one mark, now had two identical prints, side by side in the same format. Retreating was instinctive. I took the landline and called the police. While waiting to answer, the sound of the doorbell echoed again, only once, short, but loud enough to cross the chest. The attendant asked me to check if there was anyone, but I couldn't even answer. I just looked at the camera again and saw the same thing. The finger touching the button, the black glove, and the body turned on its back, motionless. The attendant stayed on the line, asking me to stay inside the house and lock all the doors. I obeyed, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking so much that I could barely fit the chain into the door. I went back to my cell phone and watched the video in real time, waiting to see the policeman arrive. But the person was still there. Now you could see the shoulder, the curve of the head covered by the hood. She was still turned on her back, motionless, her finger still resting on the button. The rain began to fall slowly, reflecting the light from the pole on the dark glove. It looked like a frozen scene. I didn't blink. Suddenly, the doorbell stopped ringing and the arm retreated. The person stood still for a few more seconds without moving, then took a step back. The hood turned a little, as if looking to the side, but never directly to the camera. Then he simply walked away, walking towards the street until he disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, looking at the screen, with the sound of my heart beating louder than the rain. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, the officer watched the video with me. He frowned and said it was the strangest thing he had ever seen, because the moment the man turned his back to the camera, the system recorded a slight electrical interference, as if something was blocking the signal. Story 4. I've been living alone for a few years in a single-story house on a quiet street, away from the city center. I've always liked the peace of the place. Few houses, polite neighbors, and the constant sound of crickets at night. It was a rainy Friday in November when it all happened. I was in the living room reading with the sound of the television low just to fill the silence. Around 10:30, I heard 3 knocks on the front door. They weren't strong, but enough to make me get up. I found it strange because no one visited me at this time. I went to the living room window and looked at the street. The pole illuminated part of the sidewalk and the rain left the floor shining. There were no cars stalled, just a distant glow of headlights on the corner. The beats were repeated, 3, spaced. "Just a second," I shouted, trying to look calm. I took my cell phone and went to the door. "Who is it?" I asked. The answer came almost immediately. A female voice, trembling, saying that she needed help. "My car broke down and can you lend me the phone?" The voice sounded weak, almost tearful. For a moment I thought about opening it, but something held me back. I asked what had happened to the car, trying to buy time. The voice was silent for a few seconds before answering. He stopped working. I think he ran out of battery." The tone seemed hesitant, as if she had invented the answer on the spot. The sound of the rain hitting the garden leaves made everything more stuffy, and for a moment I found to hear another noise, something like light steps on the gravel of the entrance. I asked where the car was, and the woman said, "There on the corner," but the way she said "there" seemed uncertain, as if she didn't know exactly where she was talking about. I took my cell phone and said I could call a tow truck for her. On the other side of the door, silence, no sound, no rain, no breath. I waited a few seconds, feeling my palms sweat. Then finally she answered lower, "No, I prefer to use the phone myself." The voice sounded different, almost as if it had changed the timbre, still feminine but firmer, less shaky. A chill went up his neck. I approached the peephole and looked. The light of the pole illuminated part of the balcony, and I could see the woman standing there, soaked, wearing a light coat. But what made me retreat immediately was not her. It was the shadow. Behind her on the right there was a second shadow projected on the balcony wall. It was taller and wider, motionless without any correspondence visible in the scene. The woman was alone, but that shadow was clearly standing next to her as if someone was there out of reach of the light. I tried to adjust the angle, but the image didn't change. The shadow remained firm, the contour slightly inclined as if the head was facing the door. I felt my whole body freeze. I pushed the peephole away and stood still, with my hand on the doorknob, not knowing what to do. On the other side, the woman hit again, now harder. "Please, it's cold. I just need a minute." Her tone seemed forced, as if rehearsing calmness. I answered with a trembling voice that I would call for help, but that I couldn't open. There was a long pause, followed by a light sound, perhaps the creaking of the porch wood. "Okay," she said lower. "But I'm not alone." That made me stop. I waited for her to continue, but the silence extended for long seconds. I leaned my ear against the door and heard something that wasn't exactly a voice. It was a deep breath, dragged too close. Then, slow steps moving away in the direction of the street. I ran to the window, pulled the curtain carefully, and saw the reflection of two bodies moving side by side in the rain, until they disappeared on the corner. I stood at the window trying to understand if I had really seen that. The street became completely empty again, and the only sound was that of the rain hitting the puddles. I took the landline and called the police, explaining what happened. The attendant asked for a description of the people, but I could only remember the woman's light coat and that shadow that didn't suit anyone. While I was talking, I went to the door again, just to check if they had really left. The balcony carpet was wet, and soon I noticed two things that made me freeze. There were marks of small shoes, probably female, and next to them, bigger footprints, barefoot. The policeman said he would send a vehicle for a ride around the area. I waited, sitting on the couch, watching the window. The rain began to decrease, and silence took over the house. About 15 minutes later, I heard the distant sound of a car and the red and blue light reflecting on the walls. I ran to the door and opened it when the policeman knocked. He asked if anyone had tried to get in and made a quick inspection on the balcony. After a few minutes, he came back and said that there was no one around, no signs of a broken car. "Are you sure it was two people?" he asked. I just shook my head. When he left, I closed everything and locked myself in the room. I lay in bed, but I couldn't sleep. I was reviewing every detail. The hesitation in the woman's voice, the silence before answering, and especially the motionless shadow next to her. It was almost 4 in the morning when I heard another sound, very weak, coming from the front of the house. A snap, followed by a slight scratch on the wood of the balcony. I held my breath. I got up and went to the window slowly, being careful not to make noise. The street pole still illuminated part of the entrance, and for a few seconds I didn't see anything. But then I realized there was something leaning against the door. A piece of paper, wet, trapped by the wind. I opened the curtain just enough to see. The paper was folded and soaked, stuck under the door frame, swaying with the breeze. I waited until dawn to go out and get it. When I finally had courage, around 7, the sun was already starting to come out between the clouds. The floor was still damp, and the paper glued to the wood seemed to have been placed a short time ago. Untie it carefully. There was only one sentence written in trembling letters. "You almost opened it. No signature, no detail. That's all." I went straight to the police station to deliver the ticket. They investigated but never found anyone. And to this day, when someone knocks on my door at night, I wait, always, to see if there is more than one shadow. Story 5. I always had light sleep, but that night I woke up in a different way. It was as if the body knew something was wrong before I even understood the reason. The room was completely dark, illuminated only by the blue glow of the digital clock on the dresser. I looked at the time, 2:58 a.m. I was silent for a few seconds, trying to understand what had woken me up, until I heard. The sound was unmistakable. Keys, the metallic tinning followed by the friction of the metal trying to enter the lock. It was from the front door. At first, I thought it was the neighbor, maybe drunk, confusing the apartment. But the sound continued, insistent, pausing and returning, as if the person was calmly testing each key. The building was small, and the hallway on the floor echoed every noise. I got up slowly, barefoot, and went to the living room. The cold floor made me shudder. With each step, The sound of the keys became clearer, closer. Now you could also hear the slight creak of the doorknob being moved in an almost careful way, as if those who were outside didn't want to make noise, but they weren't in a hurry either. I leaned against the wall next to the door, holding my breath. The sound of the keys stopped for a second, and for a moment I thought the person had left. But then I heard the noise of metal falling, a key hitting the floor, and then the sound of it being collected. Someone was really there. I looked at the lower opening of the door, that small space where a thread of light from the corridor passed, and that's where I saw a shadow moving slowly from one side to the other, blocking and revealing the light as it moved. It was not a natural movement. It seemed that the person leaned over, watching. My heart was beating so loud that I was afraid I could hear it outside. I took the cell phone to call the police, but the screen blinded me for a second with the strong light. I silenced the sound, bent down and typed the number slowly, trying not to make noise. While I was waiting to answer, I heard a sound that made me freeze. The doorknob turned. Slowly, without strength, but enough to make the metal snap. I took a step away, trembling, and the attendant's voice appeared on the phone asking what the emergency was. I tried to explain, but the voice failed. "There's someone trying to open my door," I managed to say. The attendant asked me to confirm the address and asked if I could see the person. I said no, I only saw the shadow. And it was true. That dark shape still moved slowly from one side to the other, right behind the crack of light. Sometimes it would stop completely, and I thought I had left until I saw the movement again, as if I were waiting for a reaction from me. She asked me to stay in line until the car arrived, but the sound of the corridor was different now. In addition to the keys, you could hear something else. A muffled, heavy breath as if someone touched their face against the door. The sound was so close that I could hear the slight squeal of saliva when the person inhaled. That's when I realized something that made the whole body shiver. Next to the breath came a weak sound, a kind of murmur. They weren't words, but you could distinguish syllables as if someone spoke to himself very quietly. The attendant asked me if I was in a safe place, and I could only shake my head, forgetting that she couldn't see me. Suddenly, the sound of the keys came back, now faster, more impatient. The doorknob turned once more, hard, and the internal latch vibrated, but it held. I stood still, praying not to break. I kept watching the shadow move again. Now she bent down and for a second disappeared completely from the field of light. I thought it was over, that the person had given up, until I saw something that made me retreat so hard that I hit the back of the sofa. A thin beam of light crossed the lower doorway, and next to it, something moved. It was the tip of a narrow metallic object that was slowly pushed inside, scratching the wooden floor. It looked like a screwdriver or a short blade. The noise of the metal scraping against the floor echoed in the silence of the house. I felt my mouth dry instantly. The attendant was still talking on the phone, saying that the police were on their way, but my attention was all on that sound. The tool moved a little more, as if whoever was outside was trying to reach the latch. I stepped back with my hands shaking, not knowing whether to run or stay there to make sure the door didn't open. Then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The metal stopped moving, the sound of the keys stopped, and the corridor became completely silent. I waited a few seconds before approaching again, and it was at that moment that I saw the shadow again. Now she was motionless, exactly in the center of the crack, blocking all the light. The air seemed trapped inside the house. The shadow didn't move. It was as if someone was standing leaning against the door, completely motionless. I stared at that dark strip for almost a minute without blinking. The attendant kept asking if I was still safe, but I couldn't answer. Suddenly, a dry, almost imperceptible sound echoed from the other side. 3 light touches, spaced, on the wood. As if that person was now tapping slowly with his fingers very close to my face. Not with force, but with a calm that was even worse. I walked away slowly and ran to the room, locking the door behind me. I took the flashlight and sat on the floor, listening to any noise that could indicate movement. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Until I heard footsteps, slow, dragged, moving away through the corridor of the building. With each step, the sound became weaker, until it disappeared completely. I waited for about 20 more minutes until the doorbell of the apartment rang. I almost let my heart fall from my chest, but this time it was the police. They searched the corridor and found several metal marks around the lock, in addition to a bunch of keys thrown on the floor, with one of them crooked, as if it had been forced. The police stayed there for a while, trying to understand what happened. They asked if I had enemies, if anyone had copies of my keys, and I said no. One of them commented that it was probably someone trying to enter by mistake, maybe a new resident, but the other disagreed. He said that no one tries to open a door calmly for almost 20 minutes and then leaves the keys behind. When they left, I was alone again. The house looked different, colder. The sound of the wall clock was too loud, marking every second with an annoying snap. Before going to sleep, I looked through the peephole inside the door. The corridor was empty, illuminated by the white light on the ceiling. I watched for a while, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. That's when I noticed something on the floor, a few meters from my door. A small strip of paper, probably left next to the keys. I opened just enough to reach and pulled. It was a label written with a blue pen, wet with sweat or rain. In it, a single word, testing. I took that to the police the next day, but they never found anyone. Since then, I locked the door with 3 latches and an iron bar, and even so, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I could hear the sound of the keys. Story 6. I've been living alone for a few years in a small apartment in Spokane. The building is old, with thin walls and a corridor that echoes any sound. I usually sleep early, but that night I was awake longer than usual, reading on the couch. When the landline started ringing, I automatically looked at the kitchen clock, 3:02 a.m. The shrill sound cut the silence in a strange way, because almost no one calls me, even more so on the landline. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to answer or not. After the 3rd ring, I picked up the phone. The voice on the other side was masculine, low, and calm, as if the person spoke too close to the microphone. "Are you awake?" That's all. No greeting, no name. Just that question. I didn't answer. The silence afterwards was long, heavy, and before I said anything, the call dropped. I kept looking at the device, still emitting the sound of the shutdown, and a chill ran down the back of my neck. I checked the caller ID. It showed a local number starting with the same prefix of my street. I thought about returning, but fear held me. I put the phone back on the hook and sat down, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a prank, someone dialing random numbers. But the way he asked, calm, intimate, made me restless. I went to the living room window, which faced the side street. Everything was quiet, only the pole illuminating the wet sidewalk. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that only makes noise when it falls on the gate bars. When I returned to the couch, the silence seemed different, heavy, as if the whole house was waiting for something. It was about 5 minutes until the next sound. 3 light knocks on the door. Dry, spaced, and clearly human. The heart shot immediately. I stood still, trying to hear if it came from another apartment, but the sound had been there. At my door, no doubt. I took my cell phone and looked at the time. 3:09 a.m. I thought about asking who it was, but my throat got stuck. I approached slowly and looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty, the floor reflecting the weak white light from the ceiling. I stayed there for a few seconds, breathing fast, until I heard a slight metallic noise coming from the landline. I looked back at the device, which was on the table next to the sofa. The sound came from the phone, a low, repeated snap, as if someone had just taken it off the hook on the other side of the line. I knew the phone wasn't ringing, but it was as if it had a life of its own, emitting those intermittent noises. I took it slowly and touched my ear. No voice, just a distant hiss, similar to interference. Then over the static sound, I heard something that froze me. The same male voice saying in an almost whispered tone, "Still awake?" I took a step back and dropped the phone. He hit the floor, but the hiss kept coming out of the phone for a few seconds before stopping completely. I ran to the room and closed the door, trying to think of an explanation. I didn't know anyone with that number, and no one had reason to scare me. I was silent with my ear glued to the door, until I heard another sound coming from the living room. A slight snap, the same as the wood of the entrance door does when someone touches. I got up slowly, barefoot, and walked to the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got close to the door, the sound stopped. The entire corridor was silent, and the only noise was that of the rain outside. The light from the pole entered through the cracks of the curtain and drew long shadows on the floor. I waited about 10 seconds without hearing anything until I saw something move. A shadow passing very slowly through the bottom of the door. It wasn't someone's reflection in the corridor. You could clearly see the contour of the feet, as if someone was standing there, on the other side, without making a sound. I held my breath, trying not to move, and the shadow remained motionless for a few seconds before moving again, this time going to the right, as if the person had moved away. I breathed again, but slowly. I went to the living room window, pulled the curtain a little, and looked out. The sidewalk was deserted. No car, no movement. Only the brightness of the drops reflecting the light. I waited there for a few minutes until the landline rang again. A single touch, short, and then silence. That short sound was enough for me to run and pull the wire out of the socket. The silence that came after was absolute, almost deafening. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the couch looking at the door without the courage to move. When it finally dawned, I opened the curtain in the living room and looked at the street. The sky was still gray, and the damp asphalt reflected the little light that came from the clouds. I tried to laugh at the situation, convince myself that it had been a prank or a misunderstanding. But when I went to the door to get the newspaper, I noticed something that made me freeze. Right at the height of the doorknob, there were 3 small circular marks, as if someone had hit there with the tip of his finger. Exactly 3 times. I accidentally touched them and felt that they were wet, as if they had been made a short time ago. During the rest of the day, the phone didn't ring anymore. At night, I called the phone company and asked them to track the number that had called me. They said it was from a deactivated line, belonging to an address 2 blocks from here, an apartment that had been empty for months. I took the information to the police, but the policeman just wrote it down and said it was probably someone using a false identifier. Even so, that night before going to sleep, I put adhesive tape over the phone input and pushed a piece of furniture against the door. Sometimes I still think about that voice, so calm, asking if I was awake, and what would have happened if I had answered yes. Story 7. I've always had the habit of washing the dishes before going to sleep. I live in a single-story house in the countryside of Oregon, surrounded by trees and with a small fence in the back. It's a quiet neighborhood, and the silence of the night always helped me relax. That night, around 11:30, I was finishing rinsing the dishes when I heard a light sound. 3 dry touches on the kitchen window glass. It wasn't strong, nor loud enough to scare me right away. I thought it was a branch beating because of the wind. It still rained a little, and the trees swayed slowly. I kept washing, but the sound was repeated, this time more rhythmic, more intentional. I put the plate and stood still, listening. It was clearly someone hitting with his fingertips, not the wind. I looked at the window, but the kitchen light reflected the interior, and I only saw my own reflection on the glass. I leaned a little, trying to see the dark backyard, and that's when I heard a whisper. Low, hoarse, coming from the other side of the glass. "Can you open it just a little bit?" I felt my whole body freeze. The voice was masculine, calm, but there was something wrong. An almost childish tone, forced, as if someone tried to sound harmless. I stood completely motionless, trying to process what I had just heard. The water kept running from the tap. The sound mixed with the noise of the rain outside, and for a few seconds I convinced myself that I could have imagined that. Then the whisper came again, closer, almost leaning against the glass. "Please. Just a little bit." I took a step back and turned off the tap. The silence that formed was so heavy that even the sound of the rain seemed distant. My reflection was still there, but behind it, for a brief moment, I saw something move. A shadow, an indistinct shape. I turned off the kitchen light on impulse. Suddenly, the glass became an inverted mirror, revealing the backyard outside under the dim light of the street pole. And that's when I saw it. A human contour, the head leaning against the glass, the dark face glued to the window. The body was half inclined, as if the person supported himself with one hand. I couldn't see details, just the shape, but I could tell I was looking inside. I was out of breath, unable to move, my heart beating so hard that it seemed to fill the silence. The voice came once again, but now it sounded almost fun. "Now I see you." I took a step back slowly, trying not to make noise. The kitchen floor was cold and I could feel every beat of my heart on my bare feet. The shadow outside was still, her head still leaning against the glass. I took the cell phone from the counter and dialed 911 with trembling hands. While waiting to answer, the man made a sudden movement, as if sliding his face through the window, leaving a moisture stain on the glass. "Aren't you going to open?" he whispered again, now lower, almost inaudible. The attendant answered and I tried to speak, but the voice just wouldn't come out. I managed to tell that there was someone at my window, and she asked me to go to a safe room and lock the doors. I was retreating towards the corridor, but before leaving the kitchen I heard another sound, the slight creak of the window being pressed. He was trying to open. I ran to the room and locked the door, holding the phone tightly. I told what was happening and the attendant said that a car was already on its way. While I was talking, I heard footsteps outside the house, slow, dragged, going from the kitchen to the living room. The sound was muffled by the rain, but unmistakable. The attendant's voice still echoed in my ear, but I could barely focus on what she said. The steps outside got faster, going from the living room to the backyard. I heard the sound of the wooden fence swinging, the familiar creak she made when someone passed by. I went to the bedroom window and moved the curtain away just enough to look. The rain was falling weakly now and the light from the pole illuminated a part of the lawn. I saw movement, a figure walking slowly, going around the house. I didn't run, I just walked. The strangest thing was the way the body moved, the shoulders lowered, as if the person was trying to look inside the windows. The police arrived 12 minutes later, but for me it seemed like hours. When they heard the report, 2 officers searched the entire backyard. They found footprints marked in the mud, large and sharp, stopping exactly under the kitchen window. There was also an oval mark on the glass on the outside, as if a forehead or the entire face had been pressed against it. They asked me to sleep somewhere else that night, and I went to my sister's house. When I returned the next day, there was something new in the window, a crumpled note stuck in the corner by the rain. In it, written with a shaking black pen, a single sentence: "You didn't turn off the lights so fast last time." Story 8. I live in an old house surrounded by a heavy iron gate that always makes a loud creak when it opens. It's the kind of sound you hear from any room in the house, especially at night, when everything is quiet. That morning I was in the living room watching television with low volume, trying to fall asleep. Around 2:20, I heard the familiar noise. The gate opening slowly, that sound of iron scraping, rusty, as if someone pushed hard. The sound was long, dragged, and then came the slamming of the gate. I got up on time. My first reaction was to think it was a neighbor or the wind, but the wind would never have the strength to push that gate. I went to the front window and looked at the street. The gate was closed, locked up, the same way as always. I stayed there for a while, trying to understand. The clock on the wall marked 2:24 a.m. The street was completely deserted, only the yellowish light of the pole illuminating the wet floor. I thought about going out to check it out, but the cold and silence made me change my mind. I locked the windows and went back to the couch, trying to forget the sound. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't. That sound had been real, I knew it. It was the same metallic noise as always, the kind of thing that the ear recognizes immediately. I kept looking at the television clock, watching the minutes pass slowly. Around 3 o'clock, I decided to get up and check the gate closely. I took a flashlight and went to the front door, opening only the upper lock. The cold air of the dawn came in at once, along with the smell of wet earth. I lit the flashlight and pointed at the gate. It was closed, but something seemed different. The chain was tensioned, as if it had been pulled hard and put back. I got closer, keeping the light fixed on the lock. The padlock was in place, but the closure seemed strange. I looked better and realized that it was positioned unlike usual. It was the same model, the same wear on the side, but the closure, the movable part, was turned to the opposite side. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to remember if I could have locked it like that before. But no, I always left the closure facing inside, to prevent someone from moving on the outside. I went back inside with my heart racing and locked the door with all the locks. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't relax. Each snap of the house seemed louder than usual. The sound of the fine rain falling on the roof mixed with the noise of the wall clock, creating a feeling that time was not passing. I lay on the couch looking at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that maybe the gate had just moved with the wind, even though I knew it didn't make sense. It was almost 4 when I heard it again. The same metallic sound, the long and dragged creak of the iron being pushed. But this time the noise was longer, as if the gate had been opened and held for a few seconds before closing. I jumped up, took the flashlight, and went to the window again. The street was the same, deserted, humid, illuminated by the light of the pole. The gate remained closed, motionless, no movement, no sound. But I noticed something new. The reflection of the pole light on the padlock seemed different, brighter, as if the metal had been cleaned or changed. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took the cell phone and opened the security camera, but the image was frozen, locked since 2:23 a.m., exactly the time when the first noise happened. I tried to update the camera several times, but the image was still stuck in the same scene. The closed gate, the wet floor, and the static brightness of the pole. I went to the router, restarted everything, but the connection just didn't come back. The silence inside the house seemed heavier and heavier. I walked to the kitchen to drink water, and while filling the glass, I heard a sound coming from the front, metal hitting metal 3 times. It wasn't the gate opening. It was the noise of the padlock being manipulated, slow, rhythmic, as if someone turned and released the closure just to test. I squeezed the flashlight in my hand and approached the main door. The hallway light was off, and the only lighting came from the television, still on in silent mode. I leaned my ear against the wood and heard a low breath outside, along with the soft snap of the iron being adjusted. It looked like someone was moving the chain, trying to put it back. My whole body locked. I stayed there motionless without the courage to make noise until the sound stopped. I waited almost a minute before looking out the window. The gate was the same, closed. But the padlock was now turned exactly as before, the way I always left it. That left me completely confused. It was as if someone had noticed that I noticed the change and had come back to correct it. The flashlight was shaking in my hand, and I didn't know if I should go out to check or call the police. But what would I say? Did someone change the padlock of my house for an identical one? It would soon absurd. I stood there, watching through the window for a few more minutes. The air seemed colder, and the silence of the neighborhood was so absolute that you could hear the sound of your own breathing. I decided to wait for dawn. When the sun began to rise, I opened the door slowly and went to the gate. The floor was still damp, and there were recent marks on the cement, as if someone had stepped there during the night. The chain was firm, the padlock locked, but when I looked closely, I realized the detail that made me freeze again. It was, in fact, the same model, but not the same padlock. I had a scratch on the left side of the metal body, and that one was smooth, brilliant, like new. Someone had removed my padlock and put another one just like it, just reversing the closure. I took the old one to the police, who confirmed that the key did not correspond to any recently sold model. To this day, I still use the new padlock, because no matter how much I tried, the old one was never found again. Story 9. I've been living alone for a little over a year in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building. The walls are thin, and you can hear a lot of things: footsteps, television, sometimes the sound of the neighbors' faucets. I got used to it, and I even thought it was comforting to know that there was someone on the other side. The apartment next door was Mr. Miller, a quiet man who always greeted me in the hallway. He had lived there for decades. In recent months, however, I hardly saw him. The syndic commented that he was spending more time out of town. That morning, I suddenly woke up with a different sound. They were beating, soft, coming from the wall next to my bed, the wall that separated my room from Mr.'s apartment. Miller. It wasn't a random noise, it had rhythm, as if someone hit their knuckles. 3 touches, pause, 2 more. The sound was muffled but constant. I looked at the clock, 2:47 a.m. I sat in bed for a while trying to understand if I was really hearing that or if it was some plumbing noise. But the beats continued the same way, as if someone was waiting for an answer. I stood still, listening to the sound repeat, now a little stronger as if the person had approached the wall. The first thing I thought was that Mr. Miller might have been sick. He lived alone, and I knew he was old enough. I took the cell phone on the table and sent a quick message. "Hi, is everything okay there? I heard noise on the wall." I waited, looking at the screen lit in the dark. The beat stopped for a few seconds and then came back, shorter and faster as if they were trying to call me. I got up and leaned my ear against the wall. It was the sound of fingers, I was sure. I tried to call him, but the number didn't complete. I rang again and an automatic recording answered. "This number has been deactivated." Franzi nodded, thinking he had dialed wrong. I reviewed the contact. It was the same one he had used when he texted me a couple of months ago, asking for help to go up with some boxes. I looked at the wall again. The beats had stopped. The silence now seemed stranger than the sound itself. I went to the window to try to see the facade of the neighboring building, but everything was dark, only the wind shaking the trees on the sidewalk. When I returned to the room, I realized that the sound had changed place. Now it came more from above, as if someone hit the ceiling, not strong, but enough to echo. That didn't make sense because the apartment above mine was empty since the previous month. The syndic had commented that it would only be rented in January. I stood in the middle of the room with my cell phone in my hand, trying to decide if I should call the concierge. The clock marked 3:09 a.m., and then the beats returned to the wall, at the same pace as before, only faster. I brought my ear closer again, my heart racing. I heard a different sound between the beats, something like a sigh or a weak breath very close to the wall. I opened the message block again and scrolled to the old conversations with Mr. The last one had been exactly 6 weeks ago. He thanked me for watering the plants while traveling. Just below, a gray line appeared. Number disabled. I swallowed dry. The building was in total silence, and even so I felt something vibrate lightly on the wall, as if there was someone tapping with their fingertips, patient, constant. I thought about calling the syndic, but it was more than 3 in the morning. No one was going to answer. I walked to the living room, trying to hear if the sound came from somewhere else, but it remained only there, on the bedroom wall. 3 beats, pause, 2. Always in the same pattern. I opened the application of the security cameras in the hallway, those that are facing the door of each apartment. The image was dark, but you could see the empty corridor, no movement. While watching, I heard 2 more beats, followed by a dry sound as if something had fallen on the other side. The tension made me sweat. I took the cell phone and started recording the sound just to make sure I wasn't imagining. The vibration of the wall was clear, and in the middle of the beats you could hear a light, irregular noise, which sounded like a dragging of nails in the plaster. I walked away, locking the room and going to the living room. I sat on the couch with the lights on and tried to think of an explanation. The plumbing? Rats? It didn't make sense. The beats were too orderly. When I finally thought they had stopped, I heard a single sound coming from the hallway, the slamming of the door of the apartment next door. I got up slowly, my heart beating fast. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty, illuminated by the dim light of the presence sensor. I waited a few seconds without breathing until I heard the sound again. The same door closing, but now slower, as if someone pushed it inside. I leaned my forehead against the wood, trying to listen to any movement on the other side. The silence was so absolute that you could hear the distant sound of the elevator stopping on another floor. I went back to the living room and left the cell phone recording, positioned near the wall. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees, not knowing if I should call the police. About 10 minutes passed, and everything seemed to be back to normal. Until the sound came back, but now not from beats. There were 3 light touches on my own wall coming from the inside, just behind the point where I had heard the noise before. A dry, rhythmic sound, exactly the same. I ran to turn off the cell phone, and when I went to see the recording, the audio captured the beats clearly, followed by a hoarse voice, almost whispering, saying low, Still here.
Thank you for staying until the end of this video. It's amazing to have you here accompanying me until the end of the stories. If you liked it, leave your comment telling what was the story that moved you the most. And if you are not yet registered, sign up so you don't miss the next ones. Until next night of scary stories.